Hello, this is Vincent McFadden from the University of San Francisco, and today I'm going to present to you a study and experiment done by Jani H. Shi Leung from the University of Hong Kong and John N. Williams from the University of Cambridge. Their experiment is entitled Crosslinguistic Differences in Implicit Language Learning. Basically, these two linguists conducted 3 experiments to explore the effect of prior linguistic knowledge on implicit language learning. Simply speaking, they were curious to find if one's first language positively or negatively affects second language acquisition. For example, would a native of English have it easier to study Chinese? Or, vice versa, would a native of China have it easier to study English? These test subjects included native speakers of English from the United Kingdom and native speakers of Cantonese from the University of Hong Kong. Before I present to you the experiment, I'd like to give you some background knowledge. Dr. Peruchet and Dr. Pacton, back in 2006, suggested that even arbitrary materials may not be neutral enough, for they may interact with related situational knowledge. In short, it is basically assumed by linguistics that past experiences and knowledge typically change the way we see the world and acquire a second language. As Leung and Williams say, second language learners approach language 2 acquisition with existing linguistic knowledge and habits they have gathered from their first language acquisition experience. Let's take a look at experiment 1. This experiment aims to test whether animacy may be implicitly mapped onto articles by native speakers of English and Chinese. The test subjects included 30 native speakers of English from the University of Cambridge and 27 native speakers of Cantonese Chinese from the University of Hong Kong. The Chinese test subject had varied L2 backgrounds. They participated in this study at both universities. All Hong Kong participants had English as an L2, and some also knew other L2s. Let's look at figure 1 here. It shows a key box the test subjects used to uncode and present animacy with language learning. As you can see, GI equals near and UL equals far. The test subjects were given a subject, a person, place, or thing, and the subject was presented with one of the words from the key code box. For example, GU and desk together can be translated as near desk. The subjects were able to memorize the key code for as long as they wanted, but were timed on the actual test itself. Table 1 here is an example of the English version and Chinese version of the test. The results. Both participating groups showed evidence of learning a mapping between articles and noun animacy. Table 2 shows the results here. As you can see, both Chinese and English subjects perform pretty evenly. Let's take a look at experiment 2. This experiment aimed to test whether linguistically abnormal form-based concepts may be implicitly mapped onto articles by native speakers of English and Chinese. There were 23 native speakers of English and 30 native speakers of Chinese, with various L2 backgrounds. This experiment was similar to the first experiment, but the animacy system was now replaced with a non-semantic concept. Look at table 3 here. You can see the meaning of the words in the English version. The coding would rely on whether or not the letters were capitalized. And for the Chinese version, the hidden regularity was whether the first character in a 2-character noun had more strokes than the second. Out of 23 English participants, 20 did not report relevant knowledge of the regularity in response to the first question. Out of the 29 Chinese participants, 28 did not report relevant knowledge of the regularity. The test results showed, as you can see in Table 4 here, neither group showed learning of a mapping between articles and linguistically unnatural concepts, meaning the number of capital letters in an English word or that of strokes in a Chinese character. In Experiment 3, we need to know about the Chinese classifier system, which is not used in the English language. This experiment aimed to see if concepts from the Chinese classifier may implicitly map articles by native speakers of English and Chinese. If it is only necessary that the article correlates with the semantic property of the noun, then an effect should be obtained in both Chinese and English. In essence, if grammaticalization in the first language is also a factor, then an implicit learning effect may only be obtained for the Chinese participants. The participants included 27 native English speakers and 31 native Chinese speakers. The same design was used in this experiment as the other experiments, except that long, as you can see in Table 5, FL, as a distinction became the hidden regularity governing article used in this experiment. The Chinese classifier, zhang, in Cantonese is generally used within. FL at objects, for example, sheets, paper, photos, blankets, and the counter til in Cantonese is generally used with long, thin objects. For example, rivers, straws, ties. Looking at Table 5, you can see a distinction between flat objects and long objects. As shown in Table 6, the native English speakers passed the test at a normal rate, but the data showed that native Chinese speakers were slower. The Chinese group, but not the English group, showed evidence of learning, a mapping between articles, and a concept derived from the Chinese classifier system. As you can see in Figure 6, it was concluded that first language knowledge affected implicit language learning, and that implicit learning, at least when natural language learning is concerned, is subject to constraints and biases. This study reminds me of Benjamin Whorf. Benjamin Whorf believed that first language played a role in the way we think and act. He even thought that language determines the way we see the world. This study shows examples of how our first language can affect the way we perceive the world and even how we acquire a second language. Of course, there will always be problems with the study. As Loon and Williams state, the task employed in these experiments is highly artificial and bears little resemblance to activities in everyday language learning. But we would argue that this does not compromise the relevance of the work to understanding second language acquisition. I'm curious if this notion only applies to Chinese learners and native English learners, or if other languages can be tested and compared using this experiment as well. There were only 2 languages tested. Chinese and English share common structure patterns. If comparing English or Chinese to Korean, the Korean's verb comes at the end of the sentence. Would there be different outcomes from different languages throughout the world? I would again like to acknowledge that this presentation was a summary of cross-linguistic differences in implicit language learning. Experiments done by Jani H. C. Leung from the University of Hong Kong and John N. Williams from the University of Cambridge. Also, some of my sources were acquired from Brown, First Language Acquisition in Principles of Language Learning and Teaching, the 5th edition, Thank you for listening.